Sometimes life has a way of keeping secrets buried until the moment you're ready to find them. For mountain man Jed Carter, that moment came when his faithful dog started digging at the base of an old pine tree. What Boone uncovered was an iron door built right into the living wood. Inside, Jed found crates filled with weapons and gold, all marked with the symbol of the company that had destroyed his family years ago. The same men who had burned his father's land and called him worthless had been hiding their crimes in his own backyard. Now Jed faced a choice that would change everything. But what was he willing to sacrifice for justice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jed Carter had lived through 58 winters in these mountains, and every scar on his weathered hands told a story worth remembering. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of ancient pines, 3 miles from the nearest road and a lifetime away from the complications of civilized folk. The morning mist clung to the valley below as he stepped onto his porch, coffee steaming in the cool air. Watching Boone nose around the woodpile with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age. Boone was a blue-tick coonhound with more sense than most people Jed had known. 8 years they'd been companions now, ever since the pup had wandered into his camp, half-starved and looking for someone who understood the language of silence. The dog had grown into a fine hunting partner, with a nose that could track a wounded deer through 3 counties and loyalty that ran deeper than blood. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. Jed had built it with his own hands after returning from Vietnam, using timber he'd cut and seasoned himself. Every log had been placed with care, every joint fitted tight against the mountain weather. It was honest work, the kind his father had taught him before the world went sideways. Thomas Carter had been a man of substance once, owner of 200 acres of prime mountain land that had been in the family since his grandfather's time. The property stretched along Whisper Creek, taking in some of the finest timber and grazing land in the county. Wild turkey nested in the oak groves, deer trails crisscrossed the meadows, and the creek ran clear and cold year-round. It should have been Jed's inheritance, should have been the foundation for his own family someday. Instead, it had all gone up in smoke on an October night in 1978. The fire had started in the barn, or so the investigators claimed. Faulty wiring, they said, though Thomas Carter had rewired that barn himself just 2 years prior. The flames spread to the house before the volunteer fire department could respond, and by morning, nothing remained but ash and the stone foundation that still stood like broken teeth against the skyline. Insurance money had been tied up in legal battles for years. The family's savings had dwindled away, paying lawyers and temporary housing. Thomas Carter, once a proud man who stood straight as a lodgepole pine, had bent under the weight of loss until his spine curved like a question mark. He'd died 5 years later in a rented room above the hardware store in Cedar Falls, his heart giving out while he slept. Jed had been overseas when the fire happened, finishing his second tour in the jungle hell of Southeast Asia. By the time he made it home, the ashes had been scattered by wind and weather, and his father was already a shadow of his former self. The army had taught Jed how to kill efficiently and quietly, but it hadn't prepared him for the sight of his father's defeated shoulders or the hollow look in his eyes. They got what they wanted, his father had said on one of his bitter days, staring out at the empty lot where the house once stood. Blackwood Mining Company made an offer 6 months before the fire. Fair price, they claimed, though it wasn't near what the land was worth. When I wouldn't sell, they said I'd regret it. Jed had pressed for details, but his father would only shake his head and change the subject. The old man seemed afraid to speak openly about Blackwood, as if saying their name too loudly might bring fresh trouble down on what remained of the Carter family. After the funeral, Jed had tried to investigate on his own, but the trail had gone cold. Company records were sealed, witnesses had moved away or developed sudden memory problems, and the local sheriff, A man named Rawlings, who drove a new truck every year despite his modest salary, claimed the case was closed. Accidental fire, nothing suspicious, time to move on. So Jed had retreated to the mountains, built his cabin on the only piece of Carter land that hadn't been sold to pay debts, and tried to make peace with the past. He'd lived simply ever since, trapping in winter, guiding hunters in fall, and keeping his own company most of the year. The people in Cedar Falls thought him strange, the crazy hermit who talked to his dog and never came to town except for supplies. He didn't mind their opinions. Most folks preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths anyway. His daily routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the years. Up with the sun, coffee on the porch, while Boone made his morning patrol of the property. Breakfast of whatever he'd caught or shot the day before, prepared simple and eaten with gratitude. Then the day's work, tending his garden in summer, splitting firewood in fall, checking trap lines in winter, or maintaining the cabin year-round. The mountain provided everything he needed if a man knew how to listen. Wild berries in late summer, nuts in fall, fresh trout from the creek, and game trails that had been worn into the landscape by generations of deer and elk. He grew potatoes and beans in his garden, kept a small flock of chickens for eggs, and preserved enough food each year to see him through the lean months. It was an honest living, if not a wealthy one. More importantly, it was a free living, beholden to no man's schedule or demands. The army pension helped, though he'd earned every penny of it in blood and sleepless nights. He'd been a good soldier, too good perhaps. 3 Purple Hearts and a chest full of decorations he kept in a wooden box and never displayed. The skills he'd learned in the service stayed sharp, despite the peaceful years. A man didn't forget how to move silently through hostile territory, or how to read the intentions of potential enemies. These mountains held their own lessons too. 20 years of walking the same ridges and valleys had taught him every game trail, every water source, every cave and cliff and hidden meadow. He could navigate by starlight when necessary, find shelter in a storm, and disappear into the landscape like smoke if the need arose. Martha Henderson at the library in Cedar Falls was the only person who still treated him with genuine respect when he came to town. She remembered his father, remembered the family before the troubles started. And she had the long memory of a woman who'd watched 3 generations grow up in the same small community. "Your daddy was a good man, Jed," she'd told him more than once. "What happened to him wasn't right, and folks who matter know it." She'd slip him old newspapers sometimes when he visited, articles about land deals and mining rights that never made it into the regular news. Martha understood that information was power, and she believed in arming the powerless with knowledge whenever possible. The town itself had changed over the years, not always for the better. New faces appeared regularly, men in expensive trucks who didn't wave when they passed, who asked too many questions about property lines and mineral rights. The old families were selling out or moving away, and the character of the place was shifting like sand in a windstorm. Jed had learned to recognize the signs of outside pressure. Families who'd lived in the same house for generations suddenly deciding to relocate. Mysterious accidents that befell anyone who spoke too loudly about unfair treatment. Sheriff's deputies, who were always too busy to investigate complaints against certain companies. It was a pattern he'd seen before, in other places where powerful interests wanted something that didn't belong to them. But this morning felt different somehow. Boone had been restless all week, whining at sounds Jed couldn't hear, prowling the perimeter of their property with the intensity of a dog sensing danger. The old hound had never been wrong about trouble before, and his instincts had saved Jed's life more than once during their years together. As Jed finished his coffee and prepared for another ordinary day, he had no idea that ordinary was about to become extraordinary. The iron door hidden in the heart of the pine tree was waiting, along with secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about his father's death and his family's destruction. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again, and some secrets, once exposed to sunlight, would burn everything they touched. The morning sun had barely cleared the ridge when Boone's behavior took a sharp turn toward peculiar. instead of his usual patrol around the cabin's perimeter. The blue-tick hound made a beeline for the ancient pine that stood at the edge of Jed's property, a tree so massive it would take 4 men, holding hands to encircle its trunk. Jed had walked past that pine thousands of times in 20 years, but he'd never seen Boone pay it any special attention. Now the dog was digging frantically at its base, his claws scraping against something that rang metallic against the morning air. "What you got there, old boy?" Jed called, setting down his axe and walking over to investigate. Boone looked up with dirt on his muzzle and excitement in his amber eyes. He'd cleared away decades of fallen needles, moss, and forest debris to reveal something that had no business being there: the edge of an iron door, set directly into the living wood of the tree itself. Jed knelt beside his dog, running his weathered fingers along the metal surface. The door was heavy gauge iron, designed to last, with hinges that had been crafted by someone who knew metalwork. Rust had claimed the surface, but the structure underneath remained solid. Most puzzling of all, the tree had grown around the door's frame over the years, incorporating it into the very fabric of its trunk. "How long you been hiding here?" Jed murmured, more to himself than to Boone. The hinges protested with a screech that sent birds scattering from nearby branches, but the door swung open to reveal a hollow space carved into the heart of the pine. The cavity was larger than seemed possible, extending deep into the tree's interior, lined with what appeared to be metal sheeting to prevent decay. Jed retrieved a flashlight from his cabin and returned to peer into the hidden chamber. What he saw made his blood run cold. Wooden crates were stacked floor to ceiling, each one marked with a symbol he recognized all too well: the stylized mountain peak and crossed hammers of Blackwood Mining Company. The same logo that had been on the letterhead of the final eviction notice his father had received. The same mark that had haunted his family's last desperate months. With trembling hands, Jed pulled the first crate toward the opening. The wood was dry but intact, held together with brass screws that turned easily despite their age. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were rifles, military surplus by the look of them, along with boxes of ammunition and equipment that had no legitimate business purpose for a mining company. The second crate contained ledgers, thick, leather-bound books filled with entries in a precise hand, dates ranging from 1975 to 1982. Jed opened the first volume and began to read by flashlight, his anger growing with every page. The entries detailed a systematic campaign of intimidation, bribery, and outright theft. Names he recognized from his childhood appeared alongside dollar amounts and notations like "persuaded to sell" or "problem resolved permanently." Sheriff Rawlings was listed as receiving $500 monthly for administrative cooperation. Judge Morrison, who had presided over his family's insurance case, had received a new hunting cabin in exchange for favorable rulings. But it was the entry dated October 15th, 1978, that stopped Jed's heart entirely. T. Carter remains stubborn, despite escalating pressure. Property sits on richest silver vein in county according to latest surveys. Wire solution approved. JB will handle personally. Payment authorized, $2,000. The entry was signed with the initials T.B. Sr., Thomas Blackwood Sr., the company's founder and the man who had destroyed Jed's family. Jed's hands shook as he turned the page. The next entry, dated 3 days later, was brief but damning. Carter problem resolved. Insurance claims will be contested. Property acquisition can proceed spring 1979. 20 years of wandering. 20 years of his father's broken spirit. 20 years of believing it might have been an accident after all, wiped away by a few lines in a corporate ledger. The fire that had destroyed his family's life had been deliberately set by hired arsonists, ordered by men in expensive suits who saw human suffering as nothing more than a business expense. Boone whined softly, sensing his master's distress. Jed reached out to scratch the dog's ears, grateful for the anchor to the present moment. Without that touch of warmth, he might have lost himself entirely to the cold rage building in his chest. He forced himself to keep reading. The ledgers detailed similar operations across 3 counties, dozens of families driven from their land through fire, intimidation, and legal manipulation. The Hendersons, whose farm had burned 2 months after his father's place. The Kowalskis, who'd lost their timber operation to an accidental dynamite explosion. The Yamadas, whose patriarch had died in a hunting accident after refusing to sell his mineral rights. Each entry was clinical in its detail, devoid of any acknowledgement that real people were being destroyed. Children left homeless, elderly couples dying of heartbreak. Entire family legacies erased for the sake of corporate profit margins. A third crate contained photographs, proof of the conspiracy's reach and scope. Pictures of company executives shaking hands with local officials, celebrating at expensive dinners while families suffered. Images of properties before and after accidents, showing the systematic nature of the destruction. And most damning of all, photographs of the actual arsonists and saboteurs, hired muscle brought in from out of state to do Blackwood's dirty work. Jed recognized some of the faces in the photos. Men who'd been seen around town in the months before various accidents, asking questions and taking notes. The pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle were finally falling into place, and the picture they revealed was more horrible than even his darkest suspicions had imagined. But why had this evidence been hidden here, on his own property? The answer came in the final crate, maps showing the exact location of silver deposits throughout the region, with his father's land marked as the richest find. Blackwood had needed to hide their surveying equipment and documentation somewhere secure but accessible, and what better place than property they intended to acquire eventually. The irony was bitter as mountain coffee. They'd hidden the evidence of their crimes in the very place where their primary victim's son would eventually build his life. As Jed sat back on his heels, the full magnitude of the discovery washed over him. This wasn't just evidence of historical crimes. It was proof of an ongoing conspiracy. The dates in the ledgers extended into the early 1980s, and there was no indication the operation had ended. If anything, the sophisticated hiding place suggested Blackwood intended to retrieve this material eventually. Boone nuzzled against his shoulder, offering wordless comfort. The dog had always been sensitive to human emotions, and right now he could sense the storm of grief and fury raging in his master's heart. For 20 years, Jed had carried the weight of his father's defeat, the image of a proud man, reduced to shuffling through his final years with his head bowed in shame. Thomas Carter had died believing himself a failure, unable to protect his family's legacy from forces he couldn't understand or fight. Now, Jed knew the truth. His father hadn't failed. He'd been systematically destroyed by criminals who wore business suits instead of masks, who used lawyers and bribes instead of guns and threats. The old man had fought as hard as any decent person could against an enemy that operated outside the boundaries of law and honor. As the mountain morning grew warmer around him, Jed Carter made a decision that would change the trajectory of his quiet life forever. Justice had been denied for 2 decades, but it wasn't too late to set the scales right. The men who had killed his father as surely as if they'd put a bullet in his heart were still out there, still profiting from their crimes, still destroying other families. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd chosen to wage war against a man who'd been trained by the United States Army to wage war back. Standing up slowly, Jed looked down at Boone with something approaching a smile. "Well, old friend, looks like our quiet days just came to an end. What do you say we remind some folks that Carter land remembers and Carter blood doesn't forget?" The blue-tick hound's tail wagged once, as if he understood perfectly. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the valley, crying out its wild call to the mountains. The sound echoed off the ridges like a battle cry, and Jed Carter felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the fierce joy of having a righteous enemy to fight. Jed spent the rest of that first day carefully documenting everything he'd found, using an old Polaroid camera he'd bought years ago for tracking game patterns. Each page of the ledgers, every photograph, each piece of incriminating evidence was captured on film with the methodical precision his military training had drilled into him. If something happened to the originals, he'd need proof of what he'd discovered. The surveyor's map from 1977 proved to be particularly revealing. Spread across his kitchen table under the light of a kerosene lamp, the detailed topographical chart showed mineral deposits throughout the region with surgical precision. His father's land sat directly over the richest silver vein in 3 counties, a discovery that made the systematic destruction of the Carter family not just criminal, but coldly calculated. What struck Jed most was the dates. The survey had been completed in February of 1977, a full 18 months before the fire that destroyed his family's home. Blackwood Mining had known exactly what lay beneath Carter land long before they made their initial purchase offer, long before they escalated to intimidation, and long before they resorted to arson. His father had been doomed from the moment that silver vein was discovered. As darkness settled over the mountains, Jed found himself wrestling with a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. The evidence in his possession was damning enough to bring down everyone involved in the conspiracy, but only if it reached the right hands. The question was whether those hands existed in a system that had been thoroughly corrupted by Blackwood. Money. Sheriff Rawlings was listed in the ledgers as receiving monthly payments until 1981. Judge Morrison had taken bribes in exchange for favorable rulings. Even the county prosecutor appeared in the records, his mortgage mysteriously paid off by an anonymous benefactor shortly after the Carter insurance case was dismissed. How far did the corruption extend? How many officials had been bought, and how many more had simply looked the other way when presented with evidence they didn't want to see? Boone lay beside the wood stove, watching his master pace the small cabin with patient eyes. The dog had been unusually calm since the discovery, as if he understood the gravity of what they'd uncovered and was waiting for instructions on how to proceed. "What do you think, old boy?" Jed asked, pausing to scratch behind the hound's ears. "Do we trust the system that failed Daddy, or do we handle this ourselves?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Jed had been raised to respect law and order, to believe that justice would eventually prevail if good people stood up and did the right thing. But he'd also lived long enough to understand that sometimes good people stood alone, and sometimes the right thing required more than faith in a corrupted system. His father's words came back to him, spoken during one of their last conversations before the old man's heart gave out. "I should have fought harder, son. Should have been more like you, willing to stand and face whatever came. Instead, I bent until I broke, and they got what they wanted anyway." Thomas Carter had died believing he'd failed his family, when the truth was that he'd been fighting an enemy that operated by rules he couldn't have imagined. Decent men didn't set fires to drive families from their homes. Honest businessmen didn't bribe judges and sheriffs to steal what couldn't be bought legally. His father had been defeated not by his own weakness, but by his inability to comprehend the depths of his enemy's corruption. Jed walked to the wooden chest where he kept his military decorations and documents. The Purple Hearts and Bronze Star meant less to him than the skills they represented. The knowledge of how to move unseen, how to gather intelligence, how to strike at an enemy's weak points while protecting his own vulnerabilities. Vietnam had been a different kind of war, fought in jungles against an enemy that blended into the civilian population. But the principles remained the same. Know your enemy, control the battlefield, and never engage unless you had a clear advantage. As he studied the surveyor's map by lamplight, Jed began to see the landscape with tactical eyes for the first time in 20 years. The hidden cache in the pine tree was just one location. There had to be others. A conspiracy this extensive would require multiple safe houses, weapons dumps, and communication centers. Boone suddenly raised his head, ears pricked at a sound Jed couldn't hear. The dog's body tensed, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Outside, something was moving through the woods with enough noise to attract attention. Either someone who didn't know how to move quietly, or someone who wanted to be heard approaching. Jed extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. A flashlight beam bobbed through the trees, heading directly toward his cabin. One person moving at a steady walking pace, making no effort at concealment. The visitor knocked on the door 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A pattern Jed didn't recognize, but which suggested familiarity with rural protocols for approaching an armed man's home at night. "Mr. Carter," called a woman's voice. "It's Martha Henderson from the library. I need to speak with you about something important." Jed considered his options quickly. Martha had always been trustworthy, but she'd never visited his cabin before, especially not after dark. Still, her voice carried genuine urgency, and if anyone in town might have information relevant to his discovery, it would be the librarian who kept track of everything that happened in Cedar Falls. He opened the door cautiously, keeping one hand near the hunting knife on his belt. Martha Henderson stood on his porch, looking unusually nervous, a canvas bag clutched in her weathered hands. "Martha, this is unexpected. May I come in? What I have to tell you isn't safe to discuss in the open." Once inside, with the door closed and curtains drawn, Martha settled into the chair near the fire while Boone sniffed her boots with friendly recognition. She'd always been kind to the old hound during their library visits. "I've been wondering when you'd find it," she said without preamble. "That cache in the old pine tree. Been watching for 20 years, waiting to see if you'd stumble across what your daddy suspected was hidden on your land." Jed felt the world shift slightly under his feet. "You knew about the cache?" "Suspected. Your father came to me 3 weeks before he died, asking me to research property records and mining claims going back to the 1870s. He'd found some inconsistencies that worried him, but he was too sick to investigate properly." Martha opened her canvas bag and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd give this to you when the time was right. And you think the time is right now?" Martha's eyes were steady and serious in the firelight. "I think the time was right 20 years ago, but you weren't ready then. Tonight, looking at your face, I can see that something's changed. You've found what he suspected was there, haven't you?" Jed nodded slowly. "More than suspected. Proof enough to hang them all." "Good." Martha's voice carried a satisfaction that surprised him. "Then maybe we can finally give your father the justice he never lived to see." The documents Martha had brought painted an even more complex picture of the conspiracy that had destroyed his family. Her father's research had uncovered a pattern of land acquisition by Blackwood Mining that stretched back to the company's founding in 1952. Every property they'd purchased had later revealed valuable mineral deposits, suggesting either remarkable luck or extensive illegal surveying operations. "Your daddy was a careful man," Martha explained, spreading yellowed newspaper clippings across Jed's table. He started noticing things after the fire, how quick the insurance company was to deny the claim, how certain officials suddenly seemed to have more money than their salaries would explain. He couldn't prove anything, but he documented everything he observed. Among Thomas Carter's papers was something that made Jed's blood run cold, his Medal of Honor citation from Vietnam, along with a handwritten note in his father's shaky script. The note was dated just a week before the old man's death. "Son, I know you think I gave up the fight, but I never stopped believing in you. You have skills I never had, training I never received. If the time comes when talking and legal remedies fail, remember that you were decorated for extraordinary heroism under fire. Some battles can only be won by soldiers. The enemy is still out there, still hurting families like they hurt ours. Make me proud. Your loving father." Jed's hands trembled as he read the words. His father hadn't given up. He'd been preparing his son for a war he knew he couldn't fight himself. The old man had died, hoping that someday, somehow, justice would find its way to Blackwood Mining Company. "He talked about you constantly those last months," Martha said softly. "Worried that you blamed yourself for not being here when the fire happened. worried that you'd chosen isolation over engagement because of the family's troubles. But he was proud of what you'd become, Jed. Proud of your service, proud of your integrity. He believed you were the only one who could set things right. Martha helped him organize the evidence, creating a chronological timeline of Blackwood's activities. The pattern was clear. Identify valuable properties through illegal surveying. Make lowball offers, escalate to intimidation when offers were refused, and finally resort to arson or sabotage when intimidation failed. The company had perfected a system of legal theft that had made them wealthy while destroying dozens of families. The question now, Martha said, is what we do with this information. The local authorities are compromised. We know that from the ledgers you found. State officials might be honest, but they'll need overwhelming evidence to move against a company with Blackwood's resources and connections. Jed had been thinking about the same problem. His military training had taught him the importance of intelligence gathering before any operation. You didn't engage an enemy until you understood their capabilities, their weaknesses, and their likely responses to attack. I need to know what they're doing now, he said. The cache I found suggests they're still active, still planning operations. If I'm going to move against them, I need current intelligence. Martha nodded approvingly. There's been unusual activity around town the past few months. Men in expensive trucks asking questions about property values and mineral rights. The Henderson place got an offer last week, triple what the land is worth on paper. When they refused, someone suggested they might want to reconsider for their own safety. The Hendersons were in their 70s, long-time residents who'd farmed the same land for 40 years. They represented exactly the kind of vulnerable targets Blackwood had preyed upon in the past. Any other families being pressured? At least 3 that I know of. The Kowalskis' grandson came to the library asking about his grandparents' old insurance case. Seems he's inherited their timberland, and someone's been very interested in buying it. The Yamada property changed hands last month, sold by the family for what neighbors say was far below market value. Jed made mental notes of each name, each location. A picture was emerging of renewed Blackwood activity, suggesting the company was expanding operations or preparing for some major new venture. The evidence hidden in the pine tree wasn't historical curiosity. It was part of an active conspiracy. I'm going to need to get closer to their operations, Jed said. See what they're planning, who they're targeting, how they've adapted their methods over the years. Martha looked worried. That sounds dangerous. These people have already proven they're willing to kill to protect their interests. Maybe, but I have advantages they don't know about. Jed walked to his bedroom and returned with a wooden box that hadn't been opened in years. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were items from his military service, night vision equipment, tactical gear, and documentation of specialized training that most civilians never knew existed. Martha examined the Medal of Honor citation with obvious respect. Extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. Led rescue mission through hostile territory under heavy fire, saving 12 wounded soldiers. Awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. She looked up at Jed with new understanding. You weren't just a regular soldier. Special forces. 3 tours, mostly classified operations. Jed had never spoken about his service in detail, even to his father. Some experiences were too dark to share with civilians, some skills too dangerous to discuss casually. Point is, I know how to gather intelligence without being detected, how to move through hostile territory, how to strike at an enemy's weak points. And you think Blackwood Mining Company qualifies as hostile territory? Jed thought about his father's broken spirit, about families driven from their homes by deliberate fires, about corrupt officials taking bribes while decent people suffered. I think they declared war on innocent families 20 years ago. They just didn't expect anyone to be capable of fighting back. As Martha prepared to leave, she handed him one final document, a map of Cedar Falls and the surrounding area, marked with locations where unusual activity had been reported. Be careful, Jed. Your father spent his last years hoping for justice, but he wouldn't want it to cost you your life. After she left, Jed sat by the fire studying the map, while Boone dozed at his feet. Red marks indicated properties recently sold under suspicious circumstances. Blue marks showed locations where Blackwood representatives had been seen. Green marks identified families currently being pressured to sell. The pattern suggested a coordinated campaign, with Cedar Falls as the center of operations. If Blackwood was planning something major, this sleepy mountain town was ground zero. Jed Carter had spent 20 years avoiding conflict, choosing solitude over confrontation. But some fights chose you whether you wanted them or not. His father had died believing justice was impossible. Tomorrow, Jed would begin proving him wrong. 3 days of careful reconnaissance had revealed more about Blackwood's current operations than Jed had expected to learn in a month. Moving through the mountains with the silence his special forces training had made second nature, he'd discovered something that changed everything. The conspiracy wasn't just alive, it was preparing for its biggest operation yet. Hidden among the equipment in the Pine Tree cache was a military-grade radio communication device. Still operational after all these years, Jed had initially dismissed it as obsolete technology, but curiosity had led him to power it up using a portable battery pack. To his amazement, the frequencies were still active. The radio crackled to life during his second evening of monitoring, voices discussing logistics and timelines with the casual efficiency of men accustomed to coordinating complex operations. What he heard made his blood run cold. Base-to-field units confirming timeline for Phase 3 operations. Target properties have been identified and approached. Resistance level assessed as minimal for most locations. Field Team Alpha reporting. Henderson property owners remain non-compliant despite escalating pressure. Recommend implementation of standard protocols within 48 hours. The voice that responded carried authority and cold calculation. Understood, Alpha. You're authorized for full measures if they refuse final offer. Make it look accidental, house fire, electrical malfunction. Same as the Carter operation in '78. Jed's finger tightened on the radio as he recognized the voice. It was older now, roughened by years and whiskey, but unmistakably the same man who'd spoken at his father's funeral with false sympathy, Thomas Blackwood, Jr. Son of the company's founder. Copy that, Control. What about the other properties on the list? Kowalski grandson seems more reasonable than his elders were. Apply standard financial pressure first. Escalate only if necessary. The Yamada land is already secured. Focus primary effort on clearing the Henderson obstacle. Their property is central to the new mining corridor. Jed listened with growing horror as the voices discussed human lives like business assets to be liquidated. The Hendersons, married for 52 years, were being marked for death simply because they wouldn't sell their farm. It was his father's story repeating itself, with the same players using the same methods, but this time, someone was listening who had the skills to fight back. Field Team Beta, report on Carter property surveillance. Jed's breath caught. They were watching his land. Negative activity control. Hermit maintains usual routine. Hunting, gathering firewood, trips to town for supplies. No indication he's aware of legacy cache location. Recommend continued monitoring, but minimal intervention unless situation changes. Agreed. Carter's been isolated for 20 years, poses no credible threat to operations. Focus resources on active obstacles. The dismissal stung, but Jed recognized it as a tactical advantage. His enemies saw him as a broken old man living in the woods, irrelevant to their modern schemes. They had no idea they were being hunted by someone trained to eliminate threats much more dangerous than corrupt mining executives. Over the next 48 hours, Jed used every skill his military service had taught him. He mapped Blackwood's communication patterns, identified key personnel, and located their temporary operational base. A hunting lodge 20 miles north of Cedar Falls, purchased quietly 6 months earlier through a shell corporation. The lodge sat in a remote valley, accessible only by a winding dirt road that would be easy to monitor and control. perfect for coordinating illegal activities away from prying eyes, but also perfect for someone who needed to observe those activities without being detected. Jed spent a night hidden in the forest surrounding the lodge, watching through military-issue binoculars as Blackwood personnel came and went. The operation was larger than he'd anticipated. At least 15 men, with vehicles, communication equipment, and enough weaponry to outfit a small army. But size wasn't everything in warfare. A single, well-trained operator in familiar terrain could neutralize threats many times his own force strength, especially when those threats believed themselves secure from attack. The moral weight of what he was contemplating didn't escape him. These men weren't foreign soldiers in a declared war. They were American citizens, however corrupt their activities. But they were also murderers who'd killed his father as surely as if they'd shot him, and who were planning to kill innocent elderly people for the crime of loving their land. Some choices transcended legal niceties. On his third night of surveillance, Jed witnessed something that removed all doubt about the righteousness of his mission. A black sedan arrived at the lodge, carrying two men in expensive suits, Thomas Blackwood Jr. and another man Jed didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested high-level corporate authority. From his concealed position, Jed watched through binoculars as the two executives met with the field team leaders. Maps were spread on a table, visible through the lodge's main window, locations marked with pins and annotations. Even at distance, he could see photographs of the Henderson farm, the Kowalski timber operation, and other properties marked for acquisition. But it was what happened next that sealed their fate in Jed's mind. One of the field team leaders held up a photograph, an elderly couple standing on their front porch, smiling at the camera with the innocence of people who'd never imagined they were being marked for death. The Hendersons, captured in what was clearly surveillance footage. Thomas Blackwood Jr. took the photograph, studied it for a moment, then casually dropped it into a wastebasket. The gesture was small, almost meaningless, but it revealed everything about how these men viewed human life. The Hendersons weren't people to them. They were simply obstacles to be removed, as impersonally as clearing trees from a construction site. Jed had seen enough. The return journey to his cabin took most of the night, but he moved through familiar terrain with confidence born of 2 decades' experience. Boone was waiting on the porch when he arrived, tail wagging but eyes alert to his master's grim mood. "We've got work to do, old friend," Jed said, scratching the dog's ears. "Bad men are planning to hurt good people, and somebody needs to stop them." Inside the cabin, Jed spread out everything he'd learned: radio frequencies, personnel counts, vehicle descriptions, operational timelines. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated criminal organization that had operated with impunity for decades. Protected by corruption and confident in their invulnerability, they were about to discover that some mountains had longer memories than others, and some debts could only be paid in blood. The war that had claimed his father's life and his family's legacy was finally going to have its reckoning. The morning light filtering through his cabin windows found Jed Carter sitting at his kitchen table, staring at a yellowed envelope he'd never opened. His name was written across it in his father's careful script, along with instructions that had kept it sealed for 5 long years, to be opened only if justice becomes possible. His hands shook slightly as he broke the seal. Inside was a letter dated 3 days before his father's death, written in the trembling handwriting of a man whose body was failing, but whose spirit remained unbroken. "My dear son, if you're reading this, then God has finally provided you with the means to finish what I couldn't. I pray it hasn't come too late to save other families from the fate that befell ours. I need you to know the truth about what happened, not just the facts you'll find in corporate ledgers or legal documents, but the human cost that those cold records can never capture. The night our house burned, your mother's garden was in full bloom. She'd spent 3 summers coaxing roses to grow in mountain soil, talking to them like children, celebrating each new bud like a personal victory. 20 years later, I can still smell those roses burning. I failed her, son. Failed you and your sister, and every good thing our family represented. Not because I lacked courage, but because I couldn't comprehend the nature of our enemies. I kept believing that reason would prevail, that justice would find a way, that good men would recognize evil when it showed its face. I was wrong about all of it. The men who destroyed us don't think like decent people. They see suffering as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of profit. They view human dignity as a commodity to be purchased or eliminated as market conditions require. Fighting them with honor is like bringing a prayer book to a gunfight, noble but ultimately useless. You have skills I never possessed, training that prepared you for a different kind of war. If the time comes when talking and legal remedies have been exhausted, remember that some enemies can only be stopped by force. The innocent deserve protection, even if that protection requires terrible choices from good men. I know what I'm asking of you. I know the burden I'm placing on your conscience. But I also know the character of the man you've become, and I believe you're strong enough to bear it. Be the man I couldn't be, son. Be the hero our family needed 20 years ago. There are others who suffered as we did. The Hendersons lost their oldest boy to a hunting accident after they refused to sell their timber rights. The Kowalskis' grandfather died in what was ruled a heart attack, but I saw the fear in that old man's eyes at the hardware store 3 days before. Someone had threatened him. The Yamada family left town suddenly after their barn was dynamited. Officially ruled an insurance fraud investigation, but never resolved. Find them if you can. Help them if they'll let you. Show them that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. I love you, son. I'm proud of the man you are, and sorry for the choices I'm forcing you to make. When this is over, when the accounts are settled, know that your old father rests easier because his boy had the strength to stand up when it mattered. Your loving father. Thomas Carter, P.S. Check the foundation stones of the old house. Not everything was lost in the fire. Jed had to stop reading twice, overcome by emotions he'd kept buried for years. The letter revealed not just his father's final wishes, but the depth of guilt and regret the old man had carried to his grave. Thomas Carter had died believing himself a coward, when the truth was that he'd been a decent man trapped in an indecent situation. But the postscript intrigued him. The foundation stones of the family house still stood where the fire had left them, overgrown with weeds and marked by 20 years of weather. If his father had hidden something there, it had survived whatever Blackwood's men had searched for in the aftermath of the fire. The journey to the old homestead took an hour on foot, with Boone ranging ahead and circling back like he remembered this place from some ancestral memory. The foundation stones were exactly where Jed remembered them, arranged in a rectangle that had once supported his childhood home. Blackberry vines had claimed most of the interior space, but the stones themselves remained solid and unmoved. Following his father's cryptic instruction, Jed began examining each foundation stone carefully. The third stone from the northeast corner had been subtly modified. A small cavity carved into its base, sealed with concrete that matched the original work perfectly. Only someone who knew what to look for would have noticed the alteration. Inside the cavity, wrapped in oiled leather and protected from decades of mountain weather, were documents that made Jed's discovery in the pine tree seem incomplete by comparison. His father had been more than a victim. He'd been an investigator, documenting Blackwood's crimes with methodical precision. Bank records showed suspicious payments to local officials spanning 15 years. Photographs captured meetings between Blackwood, executives and men who were later hired for security consulting. Most damning of all were recorded. Conversations his father had apparently worn a wire during his final encounters with company representatives, preserving their threats and admissions of guilt on magnetic tape. One conversation, dated a week before the fire, was particularly chilling. Thomas Carter, I know what you're planning. I have evidence of what you did to the Hendersons, to the Kowalskis. You think burning my house will silence me, but I've hidden proof where you'll never find it. Unknown voice. Old man, you don't understand what you're dealing with. We've been patient because we hoped you'd see reason, but patience has limits. Accidents happen to stubborn people. Thomas Carter. My son was decorated for heroism in Vietnam. If something happens to me, he'll come looking for answers. You really want to make an enemy of someone trained to kill? Unknown voice. Your boy's been hiding in the mountains for years, too scared to face normal society. He's not a threat to anyone, least of all us. Besides, who says he has to survive long enough to ask questions? The threat against his own life, recorded 25 years ago, sent ice through Jed's veins. They'd been planning to eliminate him along with his father, but his military service overseas had complicated their timeline. By the time he returned, they'd decided he was broken enough to pose no threat. They'd been wrong about his character then, and they were wrong about his capabilities now. Among the final documents was a list of names, other families who'd been destroyed by Blackwood over the decades, along with current addresses for surviving members. His father had spent his last years trying to build a network of victims who might someday find the strength to seek justice together. The weight of responsibility settled on Jed's shoulders like a familiar pack. This wasn't just about avenging his own family anymore. It was about honoring every victim, protecting every future target, and ensuring that the cycle of corruption and violence finally came to an end. As he walked back toward his cabin, carrying his father's legacy of evidence and determination, Jed Carter felt something he hadn't experienced since returning from war. The clarity that comes from having a mission worthy of any sacrifice. The blood test results arrived on a Thursday morning that would forever divide Jed's life into before and after. He'd submitted the sample 3 weeks earlier, driven by a nagging inconsistency in his father's medical records that had been hidden among the documents in the Foundation cache. The paperwork was routine medical history, except for one detail that hadn't made sense at the time. A note about paternity verification requested by patient dated 6 months before the fire. Why would his father have needed paternity verification for his own son? The envelope from the genetics laboratory sat unopened on his kitchen table for an hour, while Jed worked up the courage to face whatever truth it contained. Boone sensed his master's tension, pacing restlessly around the cabin and whining softly at the delay. When he finally tore open the results, the world shifted on its axis. DNA analysis report. Comparative paternity testing indicates 99.7% probability that submitted samples share paternal lineage. Subject A, J. Carter, and Subject B, T. Blackwood Jr., show genetic markers consistent with half-sibling relationship. The paper slipped from Jed's fingers, fluttering to the floor where Boone sniffed it curiously. Half-siblings. He and Thomas Blackwood Jr. were half-brothers, sharing the same biological father, which meant Thomas Blackwood Sr., the man who'd ordered the destruction of the Carter family, had been Jed's father. The implications crashed over him like an avalanche. His mother's frequent visits to town during the early years of her marriage. His father's sometimes distant behavior toward his only son. The way Thomas Carter had sometimes looked at Jed with an expression that might have been love mixed with pain, as if seeing something in his face that didn't belong there, and most devastating of all, the realization that the fire that destroyed their family hadn't been purely about business. It had been personal revenge by a man who'd lost the woman he wanted to another, and who'd spent decades nursing his bitterness until it curdled into murderous rage. Jed staggered to his chair, trying to process the magnitude of the revelation. Everything he'd believed about his identity, his family, his enemy, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies. The blood that ran through his veins was the same blood that had ordered his father's, his adoptive father's, destruction. Thomas Carter had known. The paternity verification request proved it. In his final months, facing his own mortality, the old man had discovered the truth about his son's biological parentage. And yet he'd still written that letter asking Jed to seek justice against his own blood relatives. The moral complexity was staggering. How do you wage war against your own family? How do you seek justice against the sins of a father you never knew you had? But as the initial shock wore off, a deeper understanding began to take shape. Thomas Carter, the man who'd raised him, taught him right from wrong, shown him what honor meant, was his real father in every way that mattered. Biology was just genetics. Family was built from love, sacrifice, and shared values. Thomas Blackwood Sr. might have contributed half of Jed's DNA, but he'd forfeited any claim to fatherhood the moment he chose revenge over responsibility. A real father protected his children, even the ones born from complicated circumstances. He didn't order their destruction to satisfy his wounded pride. The revelation also explained things that had puzzled Jed for years. His natural aptitude for strategic thinking, his ability to read people's motivations and predict their behavior, his instinctive understanding of how power and corruption operated. These might have been inherited traits from a man who'd built a criminal empire through cunning and ruthlessness. But those same abilities could be turned toward justice instead of exploitation, toward protecting the innocent instead of destroying them. Jed retrieved the DNA report from the floor and studied it again, looking for any possibility of error. The science was clear and unambiguous. Thomas Blackwood Jr., the man currently planning to murder the Henderson family, was his half-brother. They shared the same biological father, the same genetic legacy, the same family name they'd never both carried. Did Thomas Jr. know? Had his father ever told him about the affair with Eleanor Carter, about the son who'd grown up believing himself something he wasn't? Or was Thomas Jr. as ignorant of their relationship as Jed had been until this moment? The answer mattered, because it would determine how Jed approached the coming confrontation. Fighting a stranger who happened to share your genetics was one thing. Fighting someone who knew you were family and had chosen evil anyway was something else entirely. From his father's, Thomas Carter's, research, Jed knew that Thomas Jr. had joined the family business straight from college, showing none of the reluctance or moral questioning that might have indicated a decent man trapped by family expectations. He'd embraced the corruption, refined it, and expanded it into new territories and more sophisticated methods. Blood didn't guarantee character, and shared genetics didn't create obligations to tolerate evil. Jed thought about all the families Blackwood mining had destroyed over the decades. Elderly couples driven from their homes, children who'd grown up in poverty because their parents' land had been stolen, communities that had lost their foundations when local institutions were corrupted by Blackwood money. How many of those victims might have been his half-siblings too? If Thomas Blackwood Sr. had been as indiscriminate in his affairs as he'd been in his business practices, the old man had clearly felt entitled to take whatever he wanted, whether it belonged to other men or not. The radio in the pine tree crackled to life, interrupting Jed's dark thoughts. He'd left it powered on to monitor Blackwood communications, and now familiar voices were discussing the final preparations for the Henderson operation. Control to Field Team Alpha. Timeline has been moved up. Execute Henderson solution tonight, 0200 hours. Weather forecast shows storms moving in tomorrow. Perfect cover for electrical fire scenario. Jed's blood went cold. They were planning to murder his father's friends, his real father's friends, in less than 10 hours. Whatever existential crisis the DNA results had triggered, it would have to wait. Innocent lives hung in the balance, and he was the only person in position to save them. But the revelation changed his tactical approach in fundamental ways. This wasn't just about stopping criminals anymore. It was about confronting his own blood family and forcing them to face the consequences of decades of evil. The symbolic weight of that confrontation would matter as much as its practical results. Thomas Blackwood Jr. was about to learn that he had a brother, and that brother was going to teach him what justice looked like when it wore their father's face. As Jed began gathering his equipment for the night's work, he caught his reflection in the cabin window. For the first time he could see it, the resemblance he'd never noticed before. The strong jawline, the deep-set eyes, the stubborn set of the mouth. features he'd inherited from a man whose legacy was written in other people's blood. Tonight, he would begin writing a different legacy with that same blood, one that honored the man who'd raised him and protected the innocent people his biological family had marked for death. Some family reunions were written in fire and vengeance. This one would be no different. The helicopter's flight schedule lay spread across Jed's kitchen table like a military operations map, its precise timing and coordinates offering him the tactical advantage he needed for the confrontation that would define the rest of his life. According to the intercepted communications, Thomas Blackwood Jr. and his executive team would arrive at the mountain cache site tomorrow at 1400 hours, expecting to retrieve their hidden evidence before expanding operations into the next phase. They had no idea they were walking into a trap set by someone who'd inherited their founder's strategic mind but chosen to use it for justice instead of exploitation. Jed spent the evening hours preparing with the methodical precision his special forces training had drilled into him. Every piece of equipment was checked twice, every contingency planned for, every detail considered from multiple angles. This wasn't just about confronting his enemies. It was about ensuring that justice was served without innocent blood being spilled. The first priority was protecting the Henderson family from the assassination planned for tonight. Using his night vision equipment and moving through terrain he'd known since childhood, Jed positioned himself in the woods surrounding their farmhouse by midnight. The elderly couple had no idea death was coming for them, sleeping peacefully in the home they'd shared for 5 decades. At 01:30 hours, 2 vehicles approached the farm with headlights extinguished, parking a quarter-mile away in a grove of trees. 4 men emerged, carrying equipment that confirmed their arson intentions: accelerants, timing devices, and tools designed to make murder look like an accident. Jed let them get halfway to the house before making his presence known. The first man went down silently, struck unconscious by a tactical baton applied with surgical precision to the base of his skull. The second man managed to shout a warning before Jed's chokehold cut off his air supply and dropped him into darkness. The third and fourth men had time to draw weapons, but they were fighting in unfamiliar territory against someone who could navigate these woods blindfolded. 20 minutes later, all 4 would-be assassins were secured with zip-tie restraints. Their weapons confiscated, their mission ended before it could begin. Jed used their own radio to contact their base, mimicking the voice of the team leader he'd just neutralized. "Control, this is Alpha Team. Mission aborted due to unexpected complications. Returning to base for new instructions." The response crackled through the radio with irritation. "Understood. Alpha, report to Control for debriefing at 800. We'll reschedule for tomorrow night. By morning, the Henderson family would be safely relocated, and Blackwood's timeline would be in chaos. More importantly, 4 hired killers would be awakening in the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Office, along with enough evidence of their assassination plot to trigger state and federal investigations that no amount of local corruption could suppress. Jed had contacted Martha Henderson before beginning his night's work, using her network of library connections to arrange protective custody for vulnerable families and media attention that would make any further accidents impossible to cover up. Sometimes the best weapon against corruption was sunlight, but the real confrontation would come tomorrow, when Thomas Blackwood Jr. arrived to find his carefully planned operation in ruins and his half-brother waiting with 25 years of questions that demanded answers. The morning hours were spent making final preparations at the cache site. Jed positioned cameras to record everything that would happen, ensuring that whatever truths emerged would be preserved for history. He set up defensive positions that would give him tactical advantages while preventing his enemies from escaping before justice was served. Most importantly, he prepared himself emotionally for the revelation he would have to make. Thomas Blackwood Jr. was going to learn that he had a brother, and that brother was going to hold him accountable for decades of family crimes. The psychological impact of that revelation might be as devastating as any physical confrontation. At noon, Jed retrieved the items that would define the confrontation: his father's final letter, the DNA test results, and the complete archive of evidence documenting Blackwood's crimes. He also brought something else: a photograph of Thomas Carter taken a month before his death, showing the broken man who died believing himself a failure. "This is for you, Dad," Jed said quietly, touching the worn picture. "Time to show them what Carter honor really means." Boone sensed the gravity of the moment, staying close to his master's side as they took positions overlooking the cache site. The old hound had been Jed's constant companion through years of peaceful mountain living, but his instincts remembered older purposes. Today he would be a warrior's dog again, alert and ready for whatever violence might come. The sound of rotor blades echoed off the canyon walls at precisely 1400 hours, announcing the arrival of enemies who believed themselves invulnerable. The helicopter was expensive and well-maintained, the kind of aircraft that successful criminals used when they needed to travel quickly and discreetly. As it settled into the clearing near the pine tree, Jed could see 4 figures inside: Thomas Blackwood Jr., 2 bodyguards, and a man in an expensive suit who was probably the company's current attorney. They emerged from the aircraft with the confidence of people who'd never faced serious opposition, never imagined that their victims might fight back with weapons more sophisticated than lawyers and legal briefs. Thomas Jr. looked older than his 55 years, his face lined by decades of making decisions that required him to ignore his conscience. He wore the expression of a man who'd convinced himself that wealth justified any method used to acquire it. That power made him exempt from the moral constraints that governed lesser people. But there was something else in his bearing that caught Jed's attention, a subtle resemblance that was now impossible to ignore. The way he held his head when surveying the terrain, the methodical manner in which he examined the cache site, the strategic thinking that was clearly evaluating threats and opportunities with practiced efficiency. They were indeed related, sharing not just genetics, but inherited patterns of thought and behavior. The difference was that Jed had been raised by a man who taught him to use those abilities in service of justice rather than exploitation. From his concealed position, Jed watched his half-brother approach the iron door in the pine tree, expecting to find his father's legacy of evidence safely hidden and ready for retrieval. Instead, Thomas Jr. would discover that the cache had been emptied, its contents now in the hands of someone who understood their true significance. The moment of revelation was approaching, the confrontation that would force both men to face the consequences of choices made by previous generations and the responsibilities that came with shared blood. Justice had been delayed for 25 years, but it would not be denied any longer. As Jed prepared to step out of concealment and announce his presence, he felt the weight of his father's expectations, the hopes of all the victims who'd suffered in silence, and the moral obligation to ensure that the cycle of violence and corruption finally ended with this generation. Some family reunions were written in blood and fire. This one would determine whether that blood served justice or continued feeding an endless cycle of vengeance. The time for hiding was over. The reckoning had begun. Thomas Blackwood Jr. stood motionless beside the empty iron door, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something approaching fear as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. The cache that had protected his family's darkest secrets for decades had been stripped clean, leaving nothing but bare metal and the lingering scent of old paper and leather. Looking for something. Jed's voice carried across the clearing with the calm authority of a man who held all the cards. Thomas Jr. spun toward the sound, his bodyguards reaching instinctively for weapons that Jed had already accounted for in his tactical planning. From his position at the edge of the tree line, he had clear sight lines and multiple escape routes, while his enemies stood exposed in the open clearing with nowhere to hide. "Who the hell are you?" Thomas Jr. demanded, his voice carrying the bluster of a man accustomed to intimidating his problems into submission. "Name's Jed Carter. I believe you knew my father, The recognition that flickered across Thomas Jr.'s face was immediate and unmistakable. 25 years fell away in an instant, and he was looking at the son of the man his father had destroyed, the boy who'd grown into a threat they'd never anticipated. "Carter," he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. "The hermit from the mountain. We wondered when you might stumble across our little insurance policy." "Insurance policy?" Jed stepped into full view, letting them see that he was armed but not immediately threatening. "Is that what you call evidence of murder, arson, and systematic destruction of innocent families?" Thomas Jr.'s attorney moved closer to his client, whispering urgent advice about not admitting to anything without legal counsel present. But Thomas Jr. waved him off with the arrogance of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. "Whatever you think you found, Carter, it won't matter. Local authorities are in our pocket, state officials can be bought or discredited, and you're just a crazy old hermit whose word means nothing against a respected business operation." Jed reached into his jacket and withdrew a small digital recorder, holding it where everyone could see. "Then I suppose you won't mind if I record this conversation for posterity. Say hello to the folks at the FBI, Thomas. They're very interested in hearing what you have to say." For the first time, genuine alarm crossed Thomas Jr.'s features. The federal authorities couldn't be bought as easily as local officials, and recorded confessions had a way of ending careers and freedom alike. "You're bluffing. Nobody's listening to this. Maybe last night's failed assassination attempt on the Henderson family triggered some very uncomfortable questions from people who can't be bribed or threatened." Jed's smile was cold as mountain water. "Your boys are sitting in federal custody right now, singing songs about who hired them and what they were paid to do. Turns out professional killers aren't very loyal when they're facing life sentences." The blood drained from Thomas Jr.'s face as he realized the scope of the disaster. The Henderson operation had been critical to their expansion plans, and its failure meant exposure on multiple fronts. Worse, if their hired assassins were talking to federal agents, the entire conspiracy could unravel within days. "What do you want, Carter?" "Justice, accountability, an end to the cycle of violence your family has perpetrated for decades." Jed pulled out a folder thick with documents and photographs. "But first I want you to see something that's going to change how you think about this whole situation." He opened the folder and withdrew a photograph. Thomas Blackwood, Sr., standing beside a young woman with kind eyes and gentle features. Eleanor Carter, taken months before her marriage to the man who'd raised Jed as his own son. Recognize her? Thomas Jr. studied the photograph, confusion replacing his earlier defiance. "That's my father with some woman." "So what?" "That woman was Eleanor Carter, my mother." Jed let the words hang in the mountain air like smoke from a dying fire. "Which makes us brothers, Thomas. Half-brothers, to be precise." The revelation hit Thomas Jr. like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and horrified understanding as the implications crashed over him. The resemblance he'd noticed but dismissed, the strategic thinking patterns they shared, the way Jed's voice carried inflections that reminded him of family conversations from decades past. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was written in their shared features, in the genetic markers that couldn't lie, in the family documents Jed had discovered. DNA doesn't lie. "Brother," Jed withdrew the laboratory report and held it out. 99.7% probability that we share the same father, the same blood, the same legacy of choices that led us to this moment. Thomas Jr.'s attorney was backing away from the group, recognizing that he'd stumbled into something far beyond his expertise. Family blood feuds with criminal implications were outside his comfort zone, especially when they involved armed confrontations in remote mountain locations. "So, what happens now?" Thomas Jr. asked, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Now you get to choose," Jed replied, his hand resting on the evidence folder that could destroy everything the Blackwood name represented. "Justice, or the consequences of refusing it?" Thomas Jr. stood in stunned silence for long minutes, the DNA report trembling in his hands as he processed the magnitude of what his family's crimes had cost. Not just the destruction of innocent families, but the corruption of his own blood, a half-brother raised as an enemy because of choices made before either of them was old enough to understand their consequences. "He never told me," Thomas Jr. finally whispered, his voice hollow with betrayal. "All those years, all the stories about eliminating threats and removing obstacles, he never said one of those obstacles was his own son. Would it have mattered?" Jed asked, genuine curiosity mixing with the steel in his voice. "If you'd known we were related, would you have tried to stop the murders, the arson, the systematic destruction of families whose only crime was refusing to be victims?" The question hung between them like a sword blade, cutting to the heart of moral choices that couldn't be undone. Thomas Jr.'s bodyguards had backed away from the confrontation, recognizing that this was beyond their pay grade and expertise. Even trained killers understood when they were witnessing something that transcended simple criminal activity. "I don't know," Thomas Jr. admitted, and the honesty in his voice was more damning than any lie could have been. "I was raised to see business as war, taught that weakness was the only real sin. Sentiment was for people who couldn't afford to make hard choices. And burning down houses with sleeping families inside, that was a hard choice or just good business." Thomas Jr. flinched as if struck. The fires were set when buildings were empty. Families were given time to evacuate. No one was supposed to die. Tell that to the Henderson boy who died in what you called a hunting accident. Tell it to old man Kowalski, whose heart gave out from the stress of losing everything he'd worked for. Tell it to my father, who spent his last years broken and ashamed because he couldn't protect his family from monsters wearing business suits. Each word hit Thomas Jr. like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the human cost of decisions he'd made from boardroom tables and executive offices. The clinical language of corporate strategy couldn't disguise the reality of lives destroyed, dreams shattered, and futures stolen. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine remorse. Jed opened another folder and withdrew a legal document, a comprehensive confession and restitution agreement that Martha Henderson had helped draft with assistance from federal prosecutors who'd been quietly building cases against corporate criminal enterprises. "I want you to sign this. Full confession to all criminal activities, complete cooperation with federal investigations, and financial restitution to every family your company destroyed. In exchange, you'll receive reduced charges and the possibility of parole before you die in federal prison." Thomas Jr. read through the document with the careful attention of a man who understood that his signature would end the life he'd known and begin a very different future. The confession was comprehensive, naming names and detailing operations that stretched back decades. Signing it would implicate dozens of co-conspirators and trigger the largest criminal investigation in the region's history. "And if I refuse, then the evidence goes to federal prosecutors anyway. Your hired killers continue singing their songs to avoid life sentences, and you face charges without the benefit of cooperation agreements." Jed's voice was steady, implacable. "The only difference is whether you help clean up the mess your family made, or whether you go down fighting for a legacy built on other people's suffering." Thomas Jr.'s attorney tried one last time to intervene, warning about the legal implications of signing such a comprehensive confession. But Thomas Jr. waved him off, his attention focused entirely on his half-brother's face, searching for some sign of mercy or understanding. "We're family," he said desperately. "Blood means something." "Surely that counts for something." "It does," Jed agreed. "It means I'm giving you a chance to choose redemption over destruction. It means I'm offering you the opportunity to make amends instead of simply destroying you the way your father destroyed mine. Blood means I believe you might have inherited something decent along with the capacity for evil." The mountain wind carried the scent of pine needles and approaching weather, a reminder that nature continued its cycles, regardless of human drama. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried its wild call, and both brothers looked up instinctively, drawn by the same inherited connection to the wilderness that had shaped their different paths. Thomas Jr. accepted the pen Jed offered and signed the confession with steady hands, each letter of his name closing the door on a criminal empire and opening the possibility of justice for its victims. When he finished, he looked up at his half-brother with something approaching relief. What happens now? Now we call the federal agents who've been waiting for this conversation, and you begin making amends for a lifetime of choices that can't be undone. Jed reached out and placed his hand on Thomas Jr.'s shoulder, the first gesture of kinship they'd ever shared. And maybe someday we figure out how to be brothers instead of enemies. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed off the canyon walls, carrying federal agents and the end of the Blackwood criminal legacy. Justice had finally come to the mountains, wearing the face of family and the promise of redemption. 6 months after the confrontation at the Pine Tree Cache, Jed Carter stood in the office of the Federal District Court in Helena, Montana, watching a judge sign the final restitution order that would return his family's land to Carter ownership after 25 years of exile. The new deed bore his name in crisp legal script, along with mineral rights that made him one of the wealthier men in 3 counties, a twist of fate that would have amused his father's sense of justice. The courtroom had been packed for weeks with victims and their families, watching as the largest criminal conspiracy in Montana's history was systematically dismantled. 43 individuals had been indicted on charges ranging from arson and murder to racketeering and federal conspiracy. The evidence Jed had preserved, combined with Thomas Jr.'s cooperation, had triggered investigations that reached into state capitals and corporate boardrooms across the region. Sheriff Rawlings had been among the first to be arrested, his decades of corruption finally catching up with him in the form of federal agents with wiretapped conversations and bank records showing bribes totaling more than $200,000. Judge Morrison had resigned in disgrace rather than face trial, his judicial pension forfeited and his reputation destroyed by revelations of the hunting cabin he'd accepted in exchange for favorable rulings. But the most satisfying moment had come 3 months earlier, when the Henderson family, alive and well thanks to Jed's intervention, had received a formal apology from Thomas Blackwood Jr., along with a check for $2 million in damages. The elderly couple had wept openly in court as they heard Thomas Jr. accept responsibility for decades of terror that had made them prisoners. In their own home, Thomas Jr. himself was serving a reduced sentence of 8 years in federal prison, his cooperation having earned him consideration that his victims had never received. Jed visited him once a month, awkward conversations between brothers who were still learning how to be family despite everything that had divided them. The therapist says, "I need to take ownership of my choices," Thomas Jr. had said during their most recent visit. "Not just the ones I made, but the ones I could have made differently if I'd had the courage to think for myself instead of following father's path." Jed had nodded approvingly. Prison had aged his half-brother, but also seemed to have freed him from the weight of expectations that had shaped his entire life. For the first time, Thomas Jr. was making decisions based on his own moral compass rather than corporate strategy. The restored Carter homestead sat on 200 acres of prime mountain land. But Jed had no intention of rebuilding the family house that had been destroyed so long ago. Instead, he'd established the Thomas Carter Memorial Foundation, dedicated to helping rural families fight corporate intimidation and protect their property rights. The foundation's headquarters occupied a modest building, constructed on the same site where his childhood home had once stood. Martha Henderson had agreed to serve as the foundation's first director, her decades of quiet research and community networking making her the perfect advocate for families facing the kind of pressures the Carters had endured. Her first initiative had been establishing a legal defense fund that provided free, representation to anyone being pressured to sell their land under suspicious circumstances. Your father would be proud, she'd told Jed at the foundation's dedication ceremony. He spent his last years hoping someone would have the strength to stand up to bullies with more money than conscience. Turns out he was raising that someone all along. The ceremony had drawn hundreds of people, victims of Blackwood's crimes, their families and supporters who understood that justice delayed was not always justice denied. Jed had spoken briefly about his father's legacy, about the importance of protecting communities from predators, who saw human dignity as just another commodity, to be bought or eliminated. But the most meaningful moment had come, when he'd unveiled a memorial stone listing all the families who had suffered under Blackwood's systematic campaign of terror. Each name was carved into Montana granite, ensuring that their stories would be remembered long after the corporate criminals were forgotten. Boone had aged considerably during the months of investigation and legal proceedings, but the old hound seemed to understand that their mission was complete. He spent his days contentedly patrolling the restored property, no longer searching for hidden threats, but simply enjoying the peace that comes from a job well done. Jed had retired from active involvement in the Foundation's operations, content to let younger people carry forward the work, while he returned to the quiet mountain life he'd always preferred. The difference was that his solitude was no longer born from defeat or withdrawal from an unjust world. He'd proven that one person with courage and determination could stand against corruption and win, that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible, that family legacy could be redeemed by choosing honor over convenience. On quiet evenings, sitting on his porch with Boone at his feet, Jed sometimes read his father's final letter again, marveling at the old man's faith in his son's character. Thomas Carter had died believing himself a failure, never knowing that he'd raised exactly the kind of man needed to complete the fight he'd started. The mountains held their secrets more carefully now, watched over by someone who understood that some doors, once opened, revealed truths that demanded action. The Blackwood criminal empire was finished, its victims compensated, and its perpetrators held accountable. But more importantly, the principle had been established that wealth and power could not shield evil from consequences forever. As the sun set behind the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jed Carter felt something his father had never lived to experience. The deep satisfaction that comes from seeing justice served and knowing that future generations would be protected from the kind of predators who had once roamed these mountains with impunity. Some legacies were written in blood and suffering. Others were carved from courage and the determination to stand up when standing up mattered most. Jed had inherited both kinds of legacy, but he'd chosen which one to honor. The mountains remembered everything, and now they would remember that sometimes justice wore the patient face of a man who refused to let evil go unanswered. No matter how long the reckoning took to arrive,